we saw that the first two permanent English colonies in America were at Jamestown, 1607 in Virginia, and Plymouth, 1620 in Massachusetts region. Those were relatively small colonies. And the big one, the biggest, the third, but the biggest settlement of English people came in 1630 in what's known as the Massachusetts Bay, or Boston. Now, let's remember again what was happening in England at the time. In 1625, King Charles I came to the throne, and he had very strong Catholic leanings. This concerned the Puritans tremendously. And they had two responses: fight or flight, and they did both. Oliver Cromwell led the Puritans in a war against the king, ending in 1649 with the king losing his head and the Puritans coming to power. Those who didn't want to fight, they left. Under a man named John Winthrop, a friend of Oliver Cromwell, it was a mass exodus, sometimes called the Great Migration, from England to New England, led by John Winthrop. What happened in 1628, a man by the name of Endicott went and settled a small village called Salem, and that was the prelude to what would happen 2 years later when Winthrop would bring thousands of Puritans to Boston. Eventually 30,000 would come during the migration. Now, our friend John Winthrop was a very well-educated man. He was a lawyer. He was a good friend of people like Oliver Cromwell, very important Puritans. And in 1630, he talked approximately 1,000 English Puritans into leaving England for good and settling in Nova Anglia, New England. He was aboard the ship, the Arbella. And aboard the ship Arbella, he gave a very famous sermon called The Model of Christian Charity, where he laid out the blueprint for what their new community would be like. And the blueprint was really the Old Testament Exodus. Just as the Hebrew people left Egypt and went to the Promised Land, these Puritans were leaving the Egypt of England and going to the Promised Land of America, which he called their Zion in the wilderness. Zion is an image for Jerusalem, the great hill upon which the temple stood. They believed they would have a theocracy, or more perhaps better explained, a bibliocracy. They believed that the government should be led by God through his word, through the Bible. And the governor, the secular leader, would be John Winthrop, and his friend, the Reverend John Cotton, would be in charge of the religious, the theological direction of the community. He said in this sermon that they would be teaching Europe a lesson. He said that Boston would be a city on a hill that all of Europe would be looking at to see how God works in a powerful way. So there was a great pressure to do well, to succeed. He also insisted that they be in covenant with one another. They make vows to each other to support, to cheerlead, to encourage one another on. So that was a big emphasis of Winthrop in his model of Christian charity. One of the most important aspects of Boston was that they insisted that all people, young and old, women, men, be educated at least enough to read. The reading was important because the only way you could understand what God wanted was to be literate enough to read the Bible. They established, 6 years after their arrival, their first college in a section named Cambridge, after the great university in England, the Harvard College, given by a man named John Harvard in his will, his entire library and the funds to start the college. And it's the first college of higher learning in America. In 1642, they passed the Old Deluder Act. And the Old Deluder Act began something like this: it being that chief project of the old deluder Satan to keep people from being able to read the Bible, we hereby insist that any community that grows to the number of 50 people establish a public school where the children can be taught to learn so that they might read the Bible and know God's will. The first textbook of every Puritan child was a book called the New England Primer. The primer was letters and words and sentences. The letters began at the beginning of the primer: A, in Adam's fall, we sinned all. B, thy life to mend, this book attend. The B was the Bible. And they would go on like that. Every letter had some reference to some biblical, some important religious idea. The primer also included the foundational prayers of this country. The most famous of the New England primer prayers went something like this. Now I lay me down to sleep, I pray the Lord my soul to keep. If I should die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take. The Puritans were very concerned about death, infant death, because there was so much pox going around that children were taught every night, this might be your last day on earth. And so all of their prayers centered around that idea of the impending mortality of everybody. The textbook at Harvard was called The Body of Divinity. It was a systematic theology textbook that pretty much took Luther's ideas and Calvin's ideas and turned them into a systematic understanding of what the Protestant or the Calvinist religion was. These people were very cognizant that they were making history. They wrote everything down. They recorded it. You can go to the New England Archives Historical Register today and find all of the original documents of the Puritans. They were very cognizant of the fact they were establishing, in many ways, a new nation. They weren't yet declaring independence, but in some kind of de facto way, they were starting a new country. Their nomenclature speaks of their ideology, their towns. Salem, for example, is an Anglicanization of the Hebrew word shalom. Boston was named for John Cotton's church back in England. The Charles River and Charlestown, which is a suburb, were named for their king. Cambridge, of course, named for the university that many of them had attended. And if you look at their children's names, just the way we talked about with the Pilgrims, their children's names are very deliberately Old Testament names. Names such as Ebenezer, Ichabod, Hezekiah, Nehemiah. Those are clearly Old Testament names. They did use the descriptive names. Among the Puritans, you'll see a lot of faiths and mercies and hopes and things of that nature. And that just testifies, that's indirect historical evidence. We talked about that in our first lecture. Indirect evidence of their ideology, of their way of thinking, looking at the way they named their children.